Om Ganeshaya Namaha, Om Saraswatyaya Namaha, Om Shri Lakshmiyaya Namaha, Om Umay Namaha, Om Devi Bhagavati. Sud says in ancient days there was a king called Sudyumna, who was a man of dharma, restrained and righteous. Once Sudyumna went hunting in the forest with some of his courtiers. He went on horseback, carrying the exceptional bow, the Ajgav, and wearing precious ear studs that sparkled like bits of a star. It was a great hunt, and buck and rabbit, pheasant and teal, bison, panther and rhinoceros were their game. After a week's hunting, the king arrived at the heart of an enchanted forest that grew in the shadow of blessed Mount Meru. Mandar, Ashok, Bakul, Sal, Tal, Tamal, Champak, Panas, Nip, Madhuk, Utica, and countless other fine trees grew here, and an extravagance of flowers and fruit adorned their branches. Crystalline lakes with water birds and lotuses dotted this forest. Bamboo thickets seemed to play soft aeolian music. It seemed the birds of this one had more mellifluous throats than any other birds in the world. The forest beckoned with an exhilarating magic, and Sudyumna rode his horse eagerly into it, his courtiers after him. Suddenly his body tingled with the strangest sensation he had ever felt, and his horse below him was restless. Sudyumna thought he was fainting. When the feeling passed, he found that he had become a woman, and his horse a mare, whining in surprise. And so, too, with all his nobles and their mounts. The Munis cried, "Ah, passing strange! How did this happen?" Once, in ages gone by, some rishis like yourselves went to that same one to worship Shiv, who they had heard was there. But when they came upon the Lord in a glade beside a glassy pool, they saw in alarm that Parvati sat quite naked in his lap, and Shiv and she were making love. When she saw the Munis, she gave a cry, leapt up from Shiv's lap, and pulled on her clothes in mortification. She stood there trembling for shame, although the rishis had fled. Shiv called her to him again, but she glanced fearfully into the trees and would not come. Shiv laughed and said, "Let any man who enters this forest be turned into a woman, so you need not be afraid of being seen naked by another man. Now come back to me," and she did. The curse remained on the forest, and anyone who knew of it would avoid that one. But Sudyumna and his party were far from home, and now they found they had become women. In anguish, the king decided that he could not return to his kingdom. He would be a laughing stock, and how would he rule? Sudyumna now called herself Ela. She gave women's names to her companions as well, and they built an ashram for themselves and began living in that forest, praying for a cure to their strange affliction. It happened that Som and Tara's son Buddha, who was roaming the worlds for adventure, arrived in that forest. Being a Dev, he was not affected by Shiv's curse, but when he saw the gorgeous Ela bathing in a lotus pool, he was struck by love's lightning. She came out after her bath and saw him there, gazing entranced at her. He was the first man she had seen after she was transformed, and he was a splendid Dev. Ela stood wet before Buddha, and a fine flush crept over her naked skin. And he, wild one, did not hesitate a moment to lay her down in the soft moss beside that breeze-swept pool. Ela became pregnant by Som's mercurial son, and in time she gave birth to a fine prince, Pururavas. After the birth of her son, Ela grew more anxious than ever about the future. Meanwhile, the people of Sudyumna's kingdom believed their king had been killed by wild animals. Great Vashisht, Brahma's son, was the Kulguru to Sudyumna's royal line, and he had kept order in the kingdom by telling the people their king was not dead and would return to them soon. Now Ela sent word to his guru in secret. When Vashisht learned what had happened in the enchanted forest, he knew by mystic intuition whose curse afflicted Sudyumna. Vashisht performed a yajna to Shiv. The Lord appeared to the Muni in splendor. "What boon would you have of me, Brahmarishi?" Vashisht begged him. "Let Ela be a man again." Shiv pronounced, "He cannot entirely become a man again, but let him be Sudyumna for one moon, Ela for the next, and so on." Thus Sudyumna came home and began to rule his kingdom again, but every other month he would go into a retreat and not be seen. No one knew why their king did this, and the people were disturbed. Meanwhile, Pururavas grew into a magnificent young prince, and everyone thought he was the king's child by some woman he had met in the forest, which was not entirely untrue. When Pururavas came of age, Sudyumna gave the kingdom into the young man's able hands and went away into Vanprastha. Narad came to Ela's ashram and taught her the Devi mantra of 9 syllables. When she had chanted the mantra, both as Sudyumna and as Ela for a long time, one day the goddess stood irradiant before her. Ela Sudyumna prostrated herself at the apparition's feet, and Bhagwati drew her bhakt unto herself and gave her blissful moksha. Pururavas ruled wisely and justly. It was said of him that he knew all men's minds, but none knew his. He preserved the dharma in his kingdom, and his people were devout and prosperous. Ela's son was a fearless warrior as well, and great was his domain. Pururava's fame as a matchless king of the earth spread even to heaven, and the Apsara Urvashi was enamored of him. It so happened that by a twist of fate, a Brahman had cursed Urvashi to spend some years on earth. She arrived in Pururava's court, and which mortal man could resist the unearthly nymph? As soon as he saw her, the king wanted her for his wife. He had never seen any woman who could remotely rival that Apsara's beauty. Urvashi made 2 conditions. "I have 2 lambs I entrust to you. Let no harm ever befall them. Secondly, my eyes must never see you naked, my lord, even while we are making love. As long as both these conditions are honored, I will stay with you. But break either one, and I will vanish from your life." Pururavas accepted her conditions without a moment's hesitation, and Urvashi lived with him. That king had never experienced love such as she gave him, and soon he could not stay away from her for even an hour. Pururavas neglected his kingdom and his dharma, and his people suffered from his neglect. No longer would their noble sovereign even deign to come into his court. Instead, he appointed his ministers to attend to his tasks, while he lay in Urvashi's arms all day in a lascivious enchantment. Although he kept heavy blinds drawn across his windows and no taper burned in his room unless he was fully clothed. The years passed on earth, which are days in heaven. Then Indra noticed that the lovely Urvashi was missing from Amravati. He called some Gandharva elves and said, "It seems as if Devlok is not beautiful anymore, that Urvashi is not with us. I would be pleased if you went into the world and stole 2 ewe lambs from Pururava's palace." Vishwavavasu, lord of the Gandharvas, took some of his ethereal people and arrived in Pururava's palace. They came in the dark through a crack in the twilight. They waited until the palace slept and crept into the king's private garden. It was midnight, and the elves heard the intimate sounds of love floating down from the king's open window above them. They seized the two lambs and flew up into the sky with them. But the little creatures bleated loudly, and Urvashi jumped up from her bed even though Pururavas lay under her. She screamed at the king, "My lord, you have betrayed me. Thieves are stealing my lambs, which are like my own daughters." It was dark in that room, and Pururava sprang up to see who had taken his lady's lambs. He ran to the window and leapt out to chase the elves. Just then the Gandharvas in the sky cast glimmering moon dust down from their fine hands, and the Apsara Urvashi saw Pururavas stark naked as he ran after the thieves. That king was such a splendid Kshatriya that the Gandharvas hastily abandoned the lambs and fled. But when Pururavas brought the little beasts back, he was just in time to see his Apsara vanish into the sky. That king roared his anguish to the stars, but to no avail. He ran through the earth like the blind wind, tears streaming from his eyes, but nowhere did he find his love. At last he came panting to holy Kurukshetra, and there he saw Urvashi as a luminous mist before him. Pururavas roared, "How could you abandon me? Ah, this body of mine that you once loved will fall dead without your caresses. Come back, Urvashi." But she scoffed at him. "What lover are you that couldn't keep your word to me? What wisdom do you have that you rant like a madman now? Go back to your kingdom, mortal. Our paths have forked forever. You are too far beneath me to even dream of me again." The king felt as though she was slicing his heart with a knife, but the Apsara vanished coldly before him, and he never saw her again, says the Sut. So Vyas, who knew this ancient tale, was aware of how fickle and heartless the Apsaras of heaven are in their dealings with all men, especially men of the earth. And though his flesh screamed to possess the Apsara Ghritachi, he struggled manfully to master his desire.